There are moments in life when the silence becomes louder than any crowd, when the stillness of an empty room speaks more truth than 1,000 conversations. In those moments, you begin to feel it. Not loneliness, but something far more sacred. Solitude. There is a peculiar kind of silence that falls over the soul when one steps into solitude, not the shallow quiet of a room with no voices, but the deep humming stillness that arises when there is no one left to perform for. It is in that silence, unsettling at first, that the soul begins to stir from its long slumber. For most of us, we do not realize how many masks we wear until we are alone with no audience to wear them for. From the earliest age, we are taught, whether overtly or in the subtle language of approval, how to shape ourselves to belong. A child learns quickly that to be loud may mean punishment, that to be too emotional may bring shame, that to question too much may cause rejection. So the child, tender and needing love, begins to form masks, smiling when sad, agreeing when unsure, achieving when tired. Over time, these masks grow heavier yet more familiar than our own skin. And what happens when we carry these masks into adulthood? We wear them into our relationships, into our jobs, into our friendships, even into our moments of supposed intimacy. We become chameleons, expert at becoming what is expected. In love, we mold ourselves into the ideal partner, fearing that our true feelings, our unfiltered desires, may threaten the fragile bond. At work, we bury creativity beneath conformity, afraid to disrupt the norm. Even alone, we find ourselves haunted by the echo of others' expectations. But then comes solitude. Sometimes by choice, sometimes by life's design. A breakup, a move, a loss, a deliberate retreat. Suddenly there is no one to react to, no one to impress, no one to disappoint. The silence becomes a mirror, and at first, it reflects back confusion. You may sit alone and realize you don't know what you truly enjoy. You may stare at a blank page or a quiet morning and feel restlessness, not because anything is wrong, but because you've forgotten how to be with yourself without an agenda. It is in this discomfort that the real work begins. Without the constant dance of reacting to others, you start to feel what has long been buried. The tension in your chest that always flares around authority figures. The sadness that rises when the evening quiets. The desire for simplicity that was drowned out by years of chasing approval. These revelations are not punishments. They are invitations to finally meet the self that has lived beneath the masks. One man once told me of the transformation he underwent after spending a year living alone in a cabin by the woods. He went in thinking it would be a creative escape. What he encountered instead was a reckoning. I didn't know who I was, he confessed. For months I kept reaching for routines that weren't mine, voices that weren't mine. Then one day I stopped trying to fill the silence, and that's when I started hearing something else. My own voice, shaky at first, but real. This process is not glamorous. It is often mundane, repetitive, slow. It is not always peaceful. In solitude, you come face to face with the parts of yourself you have neglected. The dreams you discarded because they didn't fit someone else's plan. The anger you swallowed to keep the peace. The creativity you dulled so you wouldn't stand out too much. At first, these realizations can feel like grief. You mourn the years spent away from your true self. You mourn the parts of you that were silenced, but then something shifts. After the grief, a soft clarity begins to emerge. You wake one morning and realize that the coffee you've always made isn't actually how you like it. You were just mirroring someone else. You walk past a mirror and see your expression unguarded, honest. You stop performing politeness in situations that require truth. You start saying no, not out of rebellion, but out of recognition. This is not aligned with who I am. In this newfound clarity, your relationship to others also transforms. Because you have learned to see yourself, you begin to see others more clearly, not as projections, not as saviors, not as threats. You no longer chase relationships to complete you. You are no longer seduced by the illusion that someone else will rescue you from yourself. Instead, you seek connection as a celebration of your fullness, not a remedy for your emptiness. Living alone does not guarantee this awakening, but it creates the space for it. It is the crucible in which the self is revealed. And once revealed, the self begins to grow, not into perfection but into wholeness. A wholeness that can hold both joy and sorrow. A wholeness that no longer seeks applause but instead seeks truth. A wholeness that remembers who it was before the masks became second skin. There is an ancient wisdom that lives in solitude. It is the wisdom of becoming. Becoming not who you were told to be, but who you have always been beneath the conditioning. In solitude, you remember the sound of your own laughter when no one is listening. You remember the feel of your own rhythm, your own intuition. And in that remembering, you begin to reassemble the parts of you that were scattered across the years, not as a return to childhood, but as a homecoming to your essence. People often fear solitude because they confuse it with loneliness. But loneliness is the ache of being disconnected from yourself. Solitude is the healing of that ache. It is the reweaving of the bond between your outer life and your inner world. It is not about withdrawing from others, but about returning to yourself, so that you may one day return to others more whole, more grounded, more true. The journey inward can feel dark at times, not because the self is a void, but because we must pass through the shadows we've ignored. But it is through this passage that we emerge into our own light. And that light is not found in someone else's eyes. It is found in your own gaze, finally meeting itself with recognition. This is the quiet revolution of solitude. You stop being who the world asked you to be, and you start becoming who your soul remembers you are. And from that place, unmasked, unafraid, you begin to live, not for anyone else, not against anyone else, but for the self that waited patiently for you to return. There is a quiet truth that echoes through the soul once the noise of the world has dimmed, that we are born into connection, but we are also called into separation. Not a cold, bitter form of isolation, but a sacred pulling back, so that we may meet ourselves fully. This is where emotional independence is born, not in the absence of love, but in the presence of self. For most of us, emotional dependence is woven into our being long before we understand what it is. As children, our survival depends on our caregivers. We learn quickly what earns affection, what provokes punishment, and what keeps us safe. These lessons don't disappear with age. They calcify into unconscious patterns. We learn to read a room before we read our own emotions. We tune into the needs of others before our own even have a voice. We make our sense of worth contingent on someone else's eyes, someone else's approval, someone else's love. And so we drift away from ourselves, unaware that we've made others the guardians of our emotional peace. This is not a failing. It is a very human adaptation. But there comes a time when that adaptation begins to cost too much, when the exhaustion of managing others' emotions outweighs the comfort of connection, when the fear of being alone keeps us tethered to relationships that suffocate us, when the ache to be truly seen becomes louder than the fear of being truly alone. And so begins the slow journey back, the unraveling, the reckoning. Often it starts in pain, a breakup, a betrayal, a period of solitude not chosen but imposed. In that space, something happens. The people who once distracted us from our emptiness are no longer there to fill the silence. The patterns we leaned on no longer work. The old stories about who we are begin to fall apart. And it is here in this uncomfortable void that emotional independence begins its first quiet whisper. Can you be with yourself and still feel whole? To be emotionally independent is not to close off. It is not to harden. It is not to reject love or push people away. It is to no longer make others responsible for your inner state. It is to say, I can hold my joy. I can hold my sorrow. I can sit with my fear. I can walk through my confusion. And I do not need someone else to fix or validate or rescue me in order to be okay. This is not easy. It is a process of deconstructing everything we've ever believed about love and worth and identity. It is learning how to feel emotions fully without projecting them onto others. It is pausing before reacting. It is asking, what is mine? And what am I carrying that was never mine to begin with? It is taking ownership, not as blame, but as empowerment. I once knew a man who, after a painful divorce, moved to a small town alone. For the first time in his adult life, he had no one waiting at home, no children to care for, no distractions. The first weeks were agonizing. He found himself pacing the house, checking his phone compulsively, looking for anyone to affirm his worth. But eventually he stopped running. He began to journal. He took walks. He sat with the ache. And slowly, he said, he began to feel something strange. Peace. Not the peace that comes from things going right, but the deeper peace that comes from no longer needing things to go right in order to feel okay. He said, for the first time, I realized that I could feel something painful and not fall apart. I didn't need someone else to fix it. I could just feel it, and that made me stronger than I ever imagined. That strength, emotional independence, is what transforms our lives. When we develop it, we stop choosing relationships out of fear. We no longer tolerate mistreatment just to avoid being alone. We don't chase affection like it's oxygen. We become discerning. We become sovereign. Our yes becomes wholehearted. Our no becomes clear and calm. This doesn't mean we stop needing people. We are still wired for connection. But now, we engage from a place of fullness, not desperation. We love without losing ourselves. We support without overextending. We grieve without crumbling. We forgive without forgetting ourselves. And what's remarkable is that when we become emotionally independent, our relationships deepen. We no longer play roles. We show up as we are. We can listen without defending. We can disagree without needing to dominate or withdraw. We can witness someone else's pain without needing to fix it, because we know, just as we can hold ourselves, they too can hold themselves. We meet soul to soul, not wound to wound. Emotional independence also awakens creativity. When we are no longer obsessed with managing others' perceptions, our energy flows differently. We take risks. We speak honestly. We create from a place of authenticity. The inner censor grows quieter. The voice that says, "What will they think?" loses its grip. And in that freedom, our deepest gifts emerge. But perhaps, the most powerful part of emotional independence is the way it reconnects us with our own guidance. When we stop outsourcing our emotional compass, we start hearing our inner voice again. Not the voice of fear or ego or conditioning, but the deeper wisdom that has always lived beneath. The voice that says, "This is your truth." The voice that knows when to stay and when to walk away. The voice that honors your timing, your rhythm, your becoming. This voice cannot be found in someone else's eyes. It is forged in solitude, in silence, in the honest conversations you have with yourself when no one else is listening. It is the voice of the self, liberated from masks anchored in presence. To live from that place is not to escape the human experience. It is to fully inhabit it, to feel, to love, to grieve, to hope, but from the center of your being, not the edges. From the solid ground within you, not the shifting sands of others' moods or expectations. And when you stand there, in that deep-rooted presence, something in the world shifts around you. You no longer look outward for home. You become your own home, and in doing so, you give others permission to find their own too. There is a strange kind of loneliness that arises not from being alone, but from being surrounded by people who cannot see you. We call it connection because there are texts, shared spaces, smiles in passing. But beneath the surface, we know something is off. Our souls are not meeting. Our voices echo but find no real response. And yet we cling to it, because even false connection feels safer than the void. We hold tight to relationships that are shallow, conversations that skim the surface, rituals of friendship or romance that no longer nourish us, because the alternative seems too vast, too silent, too unknown. But what if that silence holds more truth than all the noise? What if living alone, truly alone with space, time, and no social crutches, has the power to shatter these illusions, to pull back the curtain on our performance of connection and confront us with the truth that we have mistaken proximity for intimacy, routine for love, and obligation for belonging. The illusion of false connection is subtle, and that is what makes it so dangerous. It doesn't always come with conflict. Often it comes dressed as comfort. You go through your days speaking, laughing, sharing meals or screens, but afterward you feel emptier. You begin to notice the way your truth shrinks around certain people, the way you smile to maintain the peace, the way your heart tightens when you cannot fully express what you feel. This is not connection, it is conformity. It is the slow death of authenticity, disguised as companionship. When we choose to live alone, we are choosing to withdraw from that dance, not out of bitterness or defeat, but out of a deep yearning for what is real. At first, it can be terrifying. The silence seems too loud. There is no one to check in with, no one to distract you from yourself. You may feel the urge to reach for your phone, to text someone, anyone, just to feel seen. But if you resist the impulse and stay in the silence, something sacred begins to unfold. Without the noise of false connection, you begin to notice your inner landscape. You realize how much of your life was shaped by others' needs. You see the ways you've compromised yourself just to maintain bonds that were never rooted in truth. You begin to grieve, not just the relationships that failed you, but the parts of yourself you abandoned to keep them. And this grief is not a mistake. It is a cleansing. It is the soul reclaiming itself after years of distortion. I once met a woman who had spent most of her life surrounded by people, family, friends, romantic partners, yet she described herself as perpetually lonely. She laughed at the right jokes, hosted the right dinners, showed up for every birthday and milestone, but inside she felt invisible. It wasn't until she moved into a small apartment alone that things began to shift. At first, she said, I thought the loneliness would swallow me, but then I realized I wasn't grieving the absence of others. I was grieving the years I spent pretending to be someone else just to feel wanted. That realization is at the heart of the transformation. Living alone strips away the scaffolding we use to keep the illusion in place. There's no one left to impress, no one left to perform for. Just you, your thoughts, your rituals, your patterns. And suddenly, you begin to ask questions that never had space to surface. Who am I when no one is watching? What do I truly crave? What kind of connection would actually nourish me? The answers don't come all at once. They emerge slowly, in the quiet moments of self-discovery. In the way you arrange your space, in the meals you cook just for yourself, in the music you play when no one else is there to judge, in the realization that your loneliness isn't a void to be filled, but a teacher, pointing to the places where you abandoned your own company. And something astonishing happens. Once you've experienced this kind of honest solitude, the illusion of false connection no longer satisfies you. You begin to crave depth. You stop entertaining conversations that never go beyond the surface. You stop making yourself smaller to avoid conflict. You start noticing the subtle energy of truth in others, and you are drawn to those who meet you with presence, not pretense. This shift is not always easy. It can mean letting go of long-held relationships, choosing quiet nights over noisy rooms, choosing introspection over approval. But it also means coming home to yourself in a way you never knew was possible. You become whole, not because others fill your gaps, but because you have retrieved the fragments of yourself that were scattered in all the wrong places. Living alone teaches you to recognize real connection, not just emotionally, but somatically. You feel it in your body when you're with someone who truly sees you. You no longer confuse excitement with resonance. You begin to trust your intuition when it tells you, this isn't it. And you honor that knowing, not out of arrogance, but out of reverence for your own soul. And when real connection does come, because it will, it meets you on solid ground. It's not built on neediness or escape. It's built on mutual recognition. You are no longer looking to be saved. You're simply looking to be met. There is no grasping, no performing, no shrinking. Just two people, standing whole, choosing to share a moment of their journeys together. In this way, solitude becomes the fire that burns away all that is false. It is not a punishment. It is a sacred rite of passage. It is the space where illusions fall and the soul remembers what it truly desires, not company for its own sake, but communion, not proximity, but presence, not distraction, but depth. When you live alone long enough to fall in love with your own company, you stop settling. You stop chasing what isn't real. You walk through the world not as someone desperate to be filled, but as someone who has already filled their own cup. And from that fullness, connection becomes something beautiful. Not a lifeline, but a celebration. And in that celebration, the soul finally breathes. When the doors close behind you and silence floods the room, you might think you've entered peace. But very quickly something stirs beneath the stillness. A whisper, a flicker, an unease you can't name. It rises from within uninvited and it waits. This presence is not a stranger. It is the part of you you've spent a lifetime avoiding. In solitude, the shadow awakens. We are creatures shaped by light, by ideals, by images of who we are supposed to be. We present to the world our polished reflections, kindness, patience, competence, strength, and we believe these fragments make up our whole identity. But beneath them, in the quiet basement of the soul, lies everything we disowned, the rage we were taught to suppress, the grief we were told was too much, the envy we pretended didn't exist, the fear that made us feel weak, the selfishness we learned to bury. These elements were cast out of the light not because they lacked value, but because they threatened the personas we believed would make us lovable. And so, the shadow grows not from evil, but from rejection. It is made of parts of ourselves that were once natural, honest, human, but were deemed unacceptable. The shadow is not our enemy. It is our wounded twin. It follows us quietly through life, speaking through sudden reactions, subtle anxieties, sabotaged relationships. It leaks out in moments we regret and then retreats again into the dark. We often blame the world for this turmoil, never realizing that it is our own denied self trying to speak to us. In the busy rhythms of daily life, we stay ahead of the shadow. We fill our calendars, surround ourselves with people, drown ourselves in noise, anything to avoid the discomfort of seeing what we've hidden. But when we are alone, truly alone, there is nowhere left to run. The distractions thin, the masks fall away, and the deeper truths begin to emerge. This is not a punishment. It is a calling. When you live alone, when you give yourself space, you step into a sacred arena, where the battle is not against others but within. You begin to notice patterns that were once invisible, the harshness in your inner voice, the shame that clings to your memories, the resentment that still lives in your chest when you think of those who hurt you. These are not random feelings. They are messages from the parts of you that have been waiting to be seen. One man I spoke with once described his first year of living alone after a long marriage. He thought it would be peaceful, even liberating. But instead, he found himself waking in the night with tightness in his chest, flooded by regrets, old fears, painful dreams. He said, "It was like ghosts had moved in with me." But over time, as he stopped running and started listening, he began to understand. Those ghosts weren't enemies. They were memories he never processed, emotions he never allowed himself to feel. In silence, they rose not to torment him, but to be released. This is the sacred labor of solitude. It brings us face to face with the aspects of our personality we denied. It asks us to stop outsourcing blame, to turn inward and sit in the raw presence of our truth. It is not easy. It can feel like falling apart. But in that falling, something else begins to form: wholeness. Because the paradox is this: the parts of us we repress do not go away. They simply grow in power, in secrecy. A person who denies their anger becomes passive-aggressive or silently bitter. One who denies their vulnerability becomes rigid, isolated. One who suppresses their sadness wears a smile like armor but feels empty underneath. These contradictions fracture us, and only by seeing them, by welcoming them, do we begin to become real. In solitude, we learn to sit with our anger and ask where it comes from. We allow our tears to fall without shame. We trace our fears back to the moments they were born, and we begin to understand ourselves not as broken, but as layered. Not as flawed, but as complex. We are not just the love we give, but also the wounds we carry, the instincts we suppress, the stories we never told. To confront the shadow is to reclaim our full humanity. It is to say, I am not just light, I am shadow and light together, and in this tension I become whole. It is to take responsibility for our emotions, not in guilt, but in courage. To say, these feelings are mine. These stories are mine. I choose to face them so they no longer control me from behind. There is a deep and silent power that comes from this work. When you know your shadow, you are no longer afraid of what lies within. You are less reactive because you understand the source of your triggers. You are more compassionate because you see in others the same struggles you have faced. You are more grounded because you have met the depths of your being and survived. And from that depth, your life begins to change. Not in dramatic outward ways at first, but in subtle, meaningful shifts. You stop pretending to be someone you're not. You stop chasing people who confirm your worth because you begin to see your worth in the mirror. You stop fearing solitude because it has become your sanctuary. Not a prison, but a sacred place of healing. You also begin to attract different kinds of connections. When you've met your shadow, you can hold space for someone else's without judgment. You no longer need relationships to complete you. They become places of genuine exchange, mutual growth, and honest presence. Living alone, then, is not just about physical solitude. It is a symbolic rite of passage, a return to the underworld of the self. It is the descent into the unconscious, where the fragments of your being lie waiting. And when you dare to go there, when you sit in the discomfort, when you face the parts of yourself you feared, you emerge not just stronger but more integrated. This is the quiet miracle of the shadow. It holds the keys to our liberation hidden inside the very feelings we tried to avoid. When we confront it, we begin to live, not as fragments, but as whole, complex, courageous beings. And from that wholeness, our lives and the way we touch the world are never the same again. In the silence of your own company, a question rises, subtle and often unexpected. Who is taking care of me? You sit in your room, no partner to lean on, no parent to phone for comfort, no friend constantly checking in. Just you, and that vulnerable, aching presence inside who still longs to be held, seen, guided. For many, this inner child is not just a poetic image, but a very real presence. A younger self, frozen in time, carrying wounds too heavy for their small hands. And now, with no one else around, you feel it stir. Living alone brings this child to the surface, without the distractions of others, without the emotional outsourcing we're used to, where we seek partners to fix us, mentors to validate us, friends to reassure us. We are left face to face with the truth. There are parts of us that were never nurtured, never truly heard, never felt safe. In solitude, these parts finally speak, and the message is simple but profound. You were waiting for someone, but maybe it's supposed to be you. We spend much of our early lives depending on our caregivers to teach us what love is, what safety means, how to comfort our pain. But many of us, even those who had parents present in the traditional sense, grew up emotionally abandoned. Perhaps they were too busy, too wounded themselves, too afraid of their own vulnerability to meet us in ours. Maybe they taught us discipline but not compassion. Maybe they gave us rules but not warmth. Maybe they praised achievement but ignored our need for emotional safety. So we grew up. But that small, unmet part of us stayed behind. In the absence of guidance, we sought substitutes. Some looked for lovers to heal them, mistaking romantic intensity for parental warmth. Others became overachievers, hoping success would quiet the cry inside. Some numbed their pain with work, food, substances, anything to avoid hearing that voice that still whispered, "I need someone to care for me." But when all the distractions fall away and you are truly alone, there is no one left to play. that role. And then the miracle begins. You begin to parent yourself. At first, this idea feels abstract, almost absurd. How can the same person who is hurting also be the healer? But that is the essence of transformation. You begin with simple acts. Cooking a meal not out of necessity, but as a gesture of love to yourself. Speaking to yourself gently when you make a mistake instead of tearing yourself down. Letting yourself rest without guilt. Listening to your own fears with compassion instead of dismissal. These are not just acts of self-care. They are reparations to the parts of you that never received care in the first place. One woman I met told me her story of finally living alone after years of codependent relationships. She described how in the beginning she panicked in the evenings, the hours stretching out like a vast emotional ocean. But then something shifted. One night, she sat down and wrote a letter to her younger self, the 5-year-old girl who always felt in the way, always too sensitive, too much. And in that letter, she said all the things she had longed to hear. You are not too much. You are allowed to cry. You are beautiful even when you are afraid. She wept for hours. But the next morning, she said, she felt a peace she hadn't known in years. Not because someone else gave it to her, but because she gave it to herself. That is the beginning of wholeness, when you stop waiting for the parent who never came, when you stop outsourcing your safety and begin building it from within, when you learn to hold your fear without abandoning yourself, when you begin to forgive yourself, not because you earned it, but because that is what love does. Parenting yourself means noticing the way you speak to yourself in the mirror. It means questioning the voice inside that says you're not good enough, asking where it came from and whether it ever belonged to you in the first place. It means creating boundaries not just with others, but with your own self-punishing habits. It means becoming both protector and nurturer, guardian and guide, fierce advocate and gentle comforter. In solitude, this transformation accelerates because the usual props fall away. There is no one to fix it for you. And at first this feels like abandonment. But then you realize maybe it's a gift. Because if someone else fixed it, you would never become who you were meant to be. This is not about becoming self-sufficient in a way that denies the need for others. Humans need connection. We thrive on love, but we must first become the source of the love we seek. Otherwise, every relationship becomes a negotiation for care, a subconscious cry of, "Parent me." That cry can never be fulfilled by another. Only when we've begun to answer it ourselves do we arrive at relationships not as children seeking salvation, but as adults offering partnership. You become the parent you always needed, not through perfection, but through presence. When you sit with your pain without numbing it, when you face your loneliness without shame, when you make choices that protect your peace, those are the acts of someone who has stepped into the role they once begged others to fill. And in doing so, you break the chain. You stop passing your wounds forward. You stop projecting your unmet needs onto others. You become a place of safety, not just for yourself, but for everyone around you. You teach not by lecture, but by example, that healing is possible. That love is something we can learn to give ourselves. That inner parenting is not a fantasy. It is a path walked not through grand gestures, but through daily moments of compassion. A path paved not with certainty, but with courage. A path that once begun changes everything, because once you know how to love yourself like that, not with indulgence, but with truth, you can never be truly alone again. The child within you is no longer abandoned. They are finally home.